birthday party. That's how my entire life, completely fell apart. My name's Ashley. I'm 36 years old, and I swear I never meant for things to get this bad. Our daughter Emma just turned 13. We threw her a little party, nothing fancy. Just a few of her friends, some pizza and cake at the house. My husband, Dan, who's 42, did his usual thing, grilling burgers, chatting with the other dads, and, staying out of the way when the girls started their games in the living room. Typical Dan. He's not the most hands-on dad, but he's steady. Reliable. A little boring, honestly. But, that's a different story. The night was fine until it wasn't. I had stepped out onto the patio to chat with one of the moms about some PDA fundraiser thing, and Dan had gone inside. When I came back in, the vibe was off. Dan was standing in the hallway, pale as a ghost, his jaw tight, his lips pressed into a thin line. Emma's voice was drifting out from her room, loud enough that it carried over the giggles of her friends. He's not even my real dad. Laughter. Kind of carefree teenage laughter that makes everything sound like a joke. My mom said he doesn't even know. I froze. My stomach dropped so fast I thought I was going to, throw up. Dan didn't look at me. He just stared at Emma's door like he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. I wanted to say something, anything, to fix it. But my brain? Totally blank. I reached for him, trying to downplay it. Kids say dumb stuff all the time, I whispered, touching his arm. He jerked away like I'd, burned him. She probably doesn't even know what she's talking about, I added quickly, but Dan turned to me, his eyes sharp. Does she? He asked, his voice low, cutting. Does she even know what she's talking about? I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Without another word, Dan walked out the front door. The rest of the party? A blur. I don't even remember saying goodbye to the other parents. I just went on autopilot, forcing myself to act normal so Emma and her friends wouldn't notice anything. When the house was finally quiet, I sat on the couch, my phone clutched in my hand, half expecting Dan to call or text. But, he didn't. It was after midnight when he came back. He didn't slam the door or yell, he just walked in like he'd gone out for a quick drive. And honestly, that made it worse. He sat across from me, his face unreadable. We need to talk, he said. I launched into damage control mode. Dan, come on. You know how teenagers are. Emma probably overheard something and twisted it into some silly story to impress her friends. She's at that age, you know? They all want to sound like they know everything. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with this look. It wasn't anger exactly. It was worse, like he didn't even know who I was. Ashley, he said finally, his voice quiet but firm, is Emma my daughter or not? And that's when I panicked. Of course she's your daughter, I said too quickly. My voice cracked just a little. I don't even know why you'd ask me that. Dan just kept staring like he could, see right through me. Then why would she say that? He asked, his tone razor sharp. Why would she tell her friends you told her I wasn't her dad? I don't know. I snapped, louder than I meant to. Maybe one of her little friends put the idea in her head, or maybe she's mad at you for not letting her get that stupid iPhone she wanted. Kids are manipulative, Dan. They say whatever they think will get a reaction, but he didn't buy it. I could see it in his eyes. Ashley, he said slowly, like he was giving me one last chance, is there something you're not telling me? No, I said way too fast. You're being ridiculous. And that's when it all started to fall apart. Dan didn't yell or accuse me of lying. He just stood up, grabbed his keys, and walked out the door again. This time, he didn't come back. By morning, I was panicking. Called Dan, texted him, left voicemails, but nothing. He wasn't answering, and my anxiety was spiraling. I even called his sister, but she hadn't heard from him either. Emma asked where he was, and I told her he'd gone on a work trip. She didn't question it, thank God. But, the thing about Dan is, he's dependable. Predictable. He doesn't just leave without saying anything. So if he was doing it now, That meant things were, worse than I thought. I couldn't stop replaying Emma's words in my head. He's not even my real dad. She'd said it so casually, like it was no big deal. Like it wasn't about to tear our family apart. I wanted to scream at her, ask her why she'd say something so cruel, so reckless. But I couldn't. How do you explain to your 13-year-old that her little joke might have just destroyed everything? On the third day, Dan finally came home. It was late, past 10, and I was sitting on the couch pretending to watch TV with a glass of wine in my hand. My heart started racing the second I heard his car pull into the driveway. I wasn't sure if I was relieved or terrified. He came in quietly, barely glancing at me as he walked past the living room. He went straight to the bedroom, and I followed him, my bare feet silent on the carpet. "Dan," I said softly as I stepped into the room. He was pulling clothes out of the closet, tossing them into a duffel bag. My chest tightened. "Are you leaving?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer right away, just zipped the bag closed and finally turned to me. His face was calm, but his eyes were hard, like he'd already made up his mind. "I need answers, Ashley," he said. "And I'm not staying here until I get them." Panic washed over me. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, even though I knew exactly what he meant. "Cut the crap," he snapped, his voice sharp. "Is Emma my daughter or not?" "Of course she is," I said, my voice rising. "Why do you keep asking me that?" Dan's jaw tightened. "Because I talked to Emma," he said coldly. "I asked her where she got the idea that I wasn't her dad. And you know what she said?" My stomach churned, but I stayed silent. "She said you told her when she was little," Dan continued, his tone dripping with disbelief. "That you told her I didn't know the truth, and she wasn't supposed to tell me." Felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I scrambled to find a way out, to spin this into something that made sense. "She's lying," I said weakly. "You know how kids are, Dan. They make stuff up." But he wasn't buying it. "She didn't sound like she was making it up," he said, his voice tight. "And honestly, Ashley, I don't even care what Emma said. I want to hear it from you. Is she my daughter or not?" My chest felt like it was caving in. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Dan's eyes narrowed, and he shook his head like he was disappointed but not surprised. "That's what I thought," he said quietly. He grabbed his bag and brushed past me, heading for the door. "Wait," I said, grabbing his arm. "Where are you going?" "To my sister's," he said without looking back. "Don't call me unless you're ready to tell me the truth." And just like that, he was gone. The house felt impossibly empty after Dan left. Emma was already in bed, completely unaware of the storm brewing around her. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the spot where Dan's duffel bag had been, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to blame him. He was overreacting, wasn't he? So what if Emma wasn't biologically his? He'd been her dad for 13 years. What did it even matter? But deep down, I knew that wasn't fair. Dan wasn't mad because of Emma. He was mad because of me. 'Cause I'd lied to him. 'Cause I'd kept this massive secret, thinking I could just, sweep it under the rug forever. I'd made a mess of everything, and now I didn't know how to fix it. The next few days were a blur of unanswered texts and voicemails. Dan stayed at his sister's, and every time Emma asked where he was, I gave her the same weak excuse. He's working on a big project. She didn't press, but I could tell she knew something was up. And honestly, I couldn't blame her. The house was different without Dan. The silence felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on both of us. Every time I replayed Emma's words in my head, "He's not even my real dad," I wanted to scream. Why did she have to say that? And why did I ever let it get to this point? By the 5th day, Dan finally called. His voice was cold and distant, and it made my stomach twist. "I need time to think," he said. "Don't call me." "Dan, please," I started, but he cut me off. "Ashley, I can't do this right now." And then he hung up. The house felt colder after that. I knew Dan needed time, but how much time? Days? Weeks? And when he finally came back, would he even want to stay? On the 7th day, Dan came home. It was late again, past 10, and I heard his car pull into the driveway. My heart was racing, my mind already spinning with a dozen different ways I could try to fix this. But when he walked through the door, he didn't look at me. He just went straight to the bedroom, and I followed, trying to stay calm. Dan, I said softly, standing in the doorway as he started pulling clothes out of the closet again. Don't, he said, his voice flat. I froze, watching as he packed another duffel bag. You're leaving again? I asked, my voice cracking. I need answers, Ashley, he said, not turning to look at me. And I can't stay here until I get them. My chest tightened. Dan, Don't lie to me, he snapped, finally looking up. His eyes were sharp, his voice colder than I'd ever heard it. I've had enough lies. I felt panic rising in my chest. Dan, I didn't know how to tell you, I stammered. Tell me now, he said firmly. Is Emma my daughter or not? I opened my mouth, and for a second I thought about lying again. About finding some way to twist the truth to make this go away. But I couldn't. No, I whispered. Dan froze, the weight of the word hanging heavy in the air. He didn't speak for a long time, just stared at me like he didn't even know who I was. Who? He finally asked, his voice low. Jared, I said quietly. It was Jared. Dan shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. Jared? The guy you worked with? The guy who disappeared the second you told him you were pregnant? I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. You knew, Dan said, his voice shaking. You knew this whole time, and you let me think. He cut himself off, running a hand over his face. I didn't know what else to do, I said, my voice trembling. You were already there, Dan. You were everything Jared wasn't, steady, dependable. I thought if I just didn't say anything, it wouldn't matter. Dan stared at me, his expression a mix of anger and heartbreak. Did you ever think about how this would affect me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Of course I did, I said quickly. That's why I kept it from you. I didn't want to hurt you. Well, congratulations, Ashley, he said bitterly. You managed to hurt me and destroy everything else in the process. He grabbed his bag and walked past me, heading for the door. Damn, wait. I called after him. He paused, his hand on the doorknob. I need time, he said quietly. I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but I can't be here right now. And then he was gone.